a Cambridgeshire village, an audience is gathered to watch a puppet show. But as the curtain rises, this audience has no idea that over half of them will be dead in little over an hour. That the barn in which they are sitting is about to be suddenly and mysteriously engulfed by flames. That it will be impossible for them to escape because the door they've just entered through has now been locked from the inside. This is the case of the puppet Inferno. On the 8th of September 1727, Robert Shepherd, his family and servants are passing through the village of Burwell, northeast of Cambridge. Shepherd is the owner of a family-run puppet show and decides that Burwell would be the perfect place to perform. Not only is there a ready audience in the area, mainly the rural working class, but Shepherd plans to keep his entry fee affordable, 1 penny or just under 50p in today's money. So he strikes a deal with a local farmer to rent out his hay barn, and when the evening rolls around, he is not disappointed. A large crowd has gathered outside the barn, made up of far more people than Shepherd's makeshift venue will actually hold. 140 men, women and children eagerly hand over their pennies and are admitted to watch the show. But with this many inside, the barn is groaning at the seams, barely able to contain them. And yet outside, the crowds are still gathering. Shepherd and his servants now begin to turn these people away. There is not room inside the barn for a single child more. There is disappointment, naturally, as the people denied entry begin to disperse. Yet many of them will not be deterred so easily. They are, it seems, still quite determined to be admitted inside to watch the show. Some of them are not shy in voicing their frustration. One man in particular, Richard Whitaker, is an ostler. He works for the owner of the barn, tending his horses, and as such, he thinks Shepherd should give him special permission to join the audience and watch the show free of charge. Shepherd turns him away with the rest. Even if there were room inside, Shepherd tells Whitaker, he would still have to pay his penny like everyone else. As Whitaker walks away, Shepherd sees that there are many others like him continuing to demand that they be let in. And as they are growing disorderly, Shepherd decides it is time for he and his players to go inside and start the show. He has a quiet word with a couple of servants and then leaves. The show begins at 8 p.m. to the delight of the audience. They are treated to conjuring tricks and puppet double acts, and this is just the warm-up. Their laughter and cheers resound from the barn, much to the frustration of those still lingering outside. But when the main show begins, nobody has the slightest notion of the level of tragedy that is about to unfold. In those last moments of calm, enthralled by the show before them, they most probably do not even smell the smoke. Then, out of nowhere, a huge roar goes up, the sound of a massive, unstoppable blaze. Before the crowd recognises what is happening, the barn is engulfed by towers of flames, spreading along the building's timbers, bursting through the thatch of the roof, fueled further by the hay stored in the roof space. The speed of the blaze is astounding. Embers and flaming pieces of the ceiling begin to drop into the audience. Pandemonium ensues, and those inside scream and stampede for the door. They know things are bad, but think they can race through the exit and escape the worst of it, outrun the flames. They are wrong. The people reach the small door and try to swing it free, but despite it having opened not an hour earlier, it will not budge. Panic rises, and the door is hammered again and again. Men put their feet and shoulders to the thing, but still it remains shut. With desperation rising as fast as the fire, the pressure on the small barn door is immense. The crowds cram behind it, crushing those at the front. Eventually, a man surges forwards, headbutting the door like an animal, and the wood finally gives. But the gap is slim, and in their blind panic to escape the Inferno, those nearest to it are trampled, their fallen bodies building up right in front of the door, stopping up the single exit more and more. Less than half an hour after the fire starts, maybe in as little as 10 minutes, the whole roof falls and the barn is overwhelmed by flames, sealing the fate of everyone still trapped inside. Even those who have managed to get out have not been able to evade the danger. The shirt of one man, himself trying to help people escape the barn, catches the flames. He is burnt to his bowels and dead a day later. A small group of people flee to an adjoining yard, but the fire spreads to the thatched buildings that surround it, and they find themselves trapped for a second time with no hope of rescue. The Inferno destroys not only the barn, stables, and outbuildings, but at least 4 of the village's houses too. An elderly woman and child perish in one of them. They have not even attended the puppet show. When the fire finally abates, the scene is horrific. Charred body parts are strewn around the place where the hay barn once stood. Survivors are forced to identify what remains of their loved ones from the carnage that is left. In many cases, the only remnant of a husband, a mother, a toddler is a head or a hand, black from the smoke. A total of 51 adults and 27 children die as a result of the tragedy. There is hardly a family in the area who is unaffected by what has happened. Robert Shepherd, the owner of the puppet show, is dead too, and so are his wife and daughter. So what did happen? How was it that so many men, women and children lost their lives that night so horrifically? Was it just an appalling accident, a dire and irrevocable chain of events? Or was there something more sinister at work? When the people inside the barn tried to escape the Inferno, they found that the door they had entered through less than an hour before, could not be opened. Why? Had it just gotten stuck? Had the pressure of the loosening timbers above put extra weight on the top of the door and caused it to jam? No. The door had been deliberately sealed, making it impossible to go in or out of the barn, and it was done on one person's orders. Just before he'd entered the barn, Robert Shepherd had had a word with his servants. He'd ordered them to see to it that the door was sealed, to prevent any members of the unruly crowd who'd been turned away from the show from sneaking in. Since there was no locking bar on the barn, Shepherd's servants instead drove nails directly into the door and jambs to ensure it stayed shut. And, unbelievably to us today, this wasn't such an unusual practice at the time. But maybe on this occasion, the servants hammered them in too far, as once the nails were in, they were extremely difficult to remove, particularly in the commotion of the fire. And so it was the owner and organiser of the puppet show, Robert Shepherd himself, who took the decision to seal the door, and in doing so sealed the fate of 78 people that night, himself, his workers, and his family included. But then, what caused the actual fire? The blaze had started on the inside of the building, so surely a candle or a lamp had been knocked over by accident. Surely nobody inside the barn, knowing they were surrounded by such flammable material, could possibly have contemplated starting the fire deliberately. They couldn't even be sure they would make it out themselves. In the hours after the fire, the son of the farmer who owned the barn came forward. He claimed he had information about what had caused the blaze. He was certain, in fact, that he could even identify the person responsible. That man was Richard Whitaker, the ostler who had been denied entry to the puppet show shortly before the door was nailed shut. The farmer's son claims he saw Whitaker with a lantern, and that just after Whitaker tended to Shepherd's horses, he had made his way back into the barn where the show was taking place, gaining access to the upper floor where the hay was stored by climbing over a partition between the stables and the barn itself. There, the farmer's son said, Whitaker had watched the show through a gap in the wood, before the flame from his lantern had set light to an adjacent bale of hay, and set the terrible events into motion. It was said Whitaker was so determined to see the show and so offended at being turned away that he would stop at nothing to gain entry. Quite how the farmer's son could give such a confident account of what had happened, since he never followed Whitaker into the hayloft, was apparently not questioned. But others supported the assertion that Whitaker was responsible, which resulted in the man's arrest. Richard Whitaker was tried for starting the barn fire at Burwell 6 months later, and yet, to everyone's surprise, he was acquitted of the crime and released without charge. Despite it being one of the worst single tragedies in the area, no clear cause for the fire could be found. The people of Burwell and its surrounding villages were left to come to terms with the fact that, Shepherd's instruction to nail the door shut aside, the events of the 8th of September were simply an appalling accident. that, with Whitaker absolved of all blame, a stray candle from the puppet show must somehow have caught and resulted in the barn catching fire. As decades passed, first-hand witnesses dwindled. The disaster became a memory of parents, then grandparents. Traumatic as it was at the time, that was that. Except it wasn't. 50 years later, in 1774, an old man dies in a neighbouring village, not 10 miles from the scene of the tragedy. And before he takes his final breath, this man makes a deathbed confession. He is, he says, the one responsible for starting the fire at the puppet show in Burwell all those years earlier. He's carried his guilt with him to the grave, and now he must unburden himself. With his dying breath, he admits the awful truth. He acted recklessly, deliberately. Furious at Robert Shepherd for not allowing him access to the puppet show, he had lit no less than 2 flames, a lantern and a candle, and crawled with them into the hayloft that night. It was no accident after all. But who was this dying man? The same man who had been tried and found innocent 5 decades earlier. Richard Whitaker. Thanks so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please do subscribe and give it a thumbs up so that others can find it too. I'll be back next week with another video, and in the meantime, links to all my social media accounts are in the description box below. Bye for now.